So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Helen Disney, for coming to join us. Welcome as well, Manish and Jean-Marc, who we have on live with us, and whoever else might join up. We're going to record this session just so that everyone is aware of that. And what we'd like to be able to do is talk today about grant funding applications, and we've got Helen on because she has experience on that. So what I thought we'd do is, Helen, if you just wanted to talk a little bit more before the recording, Manish was kind of saying, what are the things that you look to do to structure it, a sort of general overlay, and then we can ask those who are with us if they have any specific questions which you might be able to jump into.
Sure.
So you.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Really always great to chat to people, and at the moment it's just great to be able to share advice that people can use in really difficult times and try and help other people out. So glad to be here, first of all. Just a bit about my background in terms of fundraising applications. So most of the fundraising applications I've worked on in the past have been for sort of SME size organisations, often actually charities. In the past I worked in kind of the think tank and public policy world, and so a lot of people were applying for kind of research grants or sort of grants of that nature. So I have also worked more recently on some innovation grants as well for startups. And I think, to be honest, the process is not really any different. I think the only part is obviously when you're dealing with startups, it's a bit more commercial. So the budgeting and things like one of your participants, I think it's Bella, who's just joined actually, was asking about ROI. Hi, Bella, and how to measure that. So but you know, the basic process is the same really. So there's sort of two forms of grants, I guess, that people tend to apply for. One is sort of government funding. Hi, Veronica.
Hi.
Hi. So there's government funding. So at the moment, actually today is the deadline for Innovate Finance's grant funding competition that a lot of tech startups are applying for. So I'm actually speaking to a lot of people today back and forth about that. So that's one source of funding. There's also funding from charitable foundations, which shouldn't be forgotten about. And at the moment, particularly things like, I'm sure, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other big health foundations will be looking to offer grants to people that can provide solutions to COVID-19. So I guess those are the two main sorts of grants that people tend to apply for. Obviously, EU funding is another one. So the EU has a EIC accelerator and other programs where you can apply for grants as well. They are extremely long-winded, so if you're going to do that, you need plenty of time and also plenty of people to support you on that grant, because it's quite heavy-handed, whereas things like the Innovate Finance one has been designed to be pretty quick and simple. So those are just the types of grants, and then I think just a few sort of tips. I guess all of these applications have similar sections you have to fill out. So, you know, it's not necessarily that different for all these applications. So once you've done one, it gets a lot easier to then apply for others, because you can sort of reuse the same things. But it's a bit like applying for jobs. You don't just want to cut and paste the same cover letter to every job application. You want to tailor it, because every grant has quite specific criteria. So I think the number one thing to say is, first of all, before you do anything, look really, really closely at the criteria. Make sure you're eligible. It sounds obvious, but you know, if it's only for UK companies, don't apply if you're not a UK company. You know, if it's only for projects that have got some kind of emerging tech in their solution, don't apply if you're not using emerging tech. You know, so you've got to be very, very clear that you meet the criteria. Otherwise, it's just a complete waste of your time and a waste of the funders' time. And sometimes with these types of applications, they will actually vet with you in advance to see if you are eligible, because it actually saves them work, because they only want to look at valid applications. So things like, for example, I think it's the Prince's Trust or the Prince's Foundation, that they sometimes have advisors who actually go through it with you ahead of time to see that you're eligible before you even submit the application, to see you have a good chance of success. So yeah, the key things that go in, obviously kind of a short description of your project, which needs to be really, really punchy, because that's the key thing that everyone's going to remember, is the first few lines, first few paragraphs. It's a bit like your elevator speech for your company or your project. There's nearly always a slightly longer version of that, which goes into detail about how you're actually going to deliver it. and sort of what's measurable in terms of the success of the project. And then probably the most difficult part always is budget. So people ask for budget, and it's very hard to do that sometimes because it's a bit pie in the sky. You don't know exactly, what's going to happen in the future, especially for innovation projects. And what Bella was saying about ROI, it's really, really hard to know 5 years out what's my kind of turnover going to be, what's my return on investment going to be. So I think having it based on some kind of research, some kind of facts, if you can, so assess the likelihood of, what the potential market for your product is, what your competitors are doing, how they've evolved. Maybe if you have any kind of potential orders placed or commercial partnerships, things like that you can include in your presentation, in your application, that's really useful. But sort of try and make it realistic. So don't be a bit like applying for any kind of investment. Don't put some crazy figure that says, you're going to suddenly go from zero to making 50 million pounds in the first year. Is probably not realistic. So put something in that you think is credible, but also attractive, which is probably going to be somewhere between a low figure and an extremely high figure. So some sort of realistic figure. I think it's also worth saying that often things don't translate into these forms. So if you do a spreadsheet, it's probably not going to cut and paste well into one of these forms. So probably my top practical tip is create a Google document, paste in all the kind of application criteria, the word counts, character counts, all of these things have very strict little boxes that you have to paste everything into. Work with your team, do everything in that Google Doc, double check it a million times to make sure you've got the right character count, the right word count for each box, that the box meets the criteria. If there's a budget part, make sure you just have a Word version as well. So it's just lines of Word text, not necessarily a spreadsheet that you're going to paste and then it doesn't work at the last minute. And then you can have all of that ready, get everyone in the team, whoever's the final person in charge, to approve the whole thing. And then it doesn't have to be the CEO, somebody else can go in and paste in the boxes once it's approved, but make sure you have that, because what often happens with these applications is there's loads and loads of boxes and you start the process, and you can save it as you go along, but it's a lot easier to do it all offline, agree it, get everyone to sign it off, and then kind of paste it in ahead of the deadline. And I think the other last tip is don't leave it to the last day, because often these platforms crash. So, if the deadline of the application is midnight today, ideally you would have submitted it yesterday, because on the very last day, and certainly in the last hours leading up to the deadline, every single other person will try and submit their application. And quite often these platforms tend to freeze up. And then if you miss the deadline, that's it, it's over. There's not usually any extension. So just be prepared to have it ready, ideally at least 24 hours in advance of the deadline if you can. So those are kind of big picture tips. Be happy to answer any specific questions that people have about applications or sources of funding or anything else, really.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. Bella, did you want to ask your question that you'd emailed, and any other subsequent questions that you might have?
Sure, yeah, hello everyone. Hope everyone is feeling good. So I have some questions again about the ROI. Yes, return on investment. So what we did last time in our previous application, for Smart Grant, by the way, question 10, cost and value of money, we had a projection of, let's say, 5-year revenue and profitability, and we checked with people within our industry, and everyone said that it sounds realistic in terms of the projections. However, when we try to plug in the calculation for return on investment for Innovate UK, what I mean by that is, let's say we ask for 100K, we take 70% of that, assuming that's the amount Innovate UK gonna give us, divided that over the profitability in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and that came out to be quite high. So for instance, I think for year 5, return on investment is like 1,000-something%, which was really high, but it's again realistic figures. So now I guess my question here is, how do we appear justify to the judges? Because if we don't bring up the return on investment, then we risk not answering one of the sub questions.
Yeah.
But if we do, then there's not enough room for us to justify that this calculation is based on only 70% of the initial ask.
Right. have you been able to actually go to Innovate Finance and ask for any feedback on that question? And what did they say?
So I called customer service, and they said, they said, you know, you just use your, basically try your best. They didn't really say anything of substance that we could use. So
Right.
yeah. I mean,
And
we asked them, do they, oh, sorry, Veronica.
Yes, hi, sorry. I was just thinking of something. So, I mean, I'm not related to any grants or anything like that, but I'm talking from a different perspective. Now, when you look at a startup, right, and you have to look at, as you said, the industry, let's say what is growth year on year, percentage-wise, at similar companies within your industry, if you can find that kind of reports, usually from public companies, let's say, but you have to keep in mind that those are large companies. And another thing that you have to keep in mind is that in general, you cannot perform better than the economy, the overall economy. Because you can say, I'm going to have 1,000% increase, you know, in 5 years time, you know, like whatever profit ROI we want to call it. But ultimately, if that results in saying, oh, my growth is going to be 10, 20%, but the economy is only performing at 3% per year, then you're saying, I'm better than the whole economy. So you have to keep a realistic view of these growth figures when, you know, as a startup.
But then I think when it comes to percentage, a smaller startup will always have a much higher growth rate to entire economy, which is very big already, right? Because I guess 1% of, let's say, a 1 trillion economy is much more than, let's say, 100% growth of a £1,000 company. But you have
I get that, but I think you have to look at it, you know, especially because you have things like discount rates and all sorts of other things. I mean, I know this is a grant, but there are all sorts of other numbers that you have to take into consideration. If you look at the VC world, for example, if you would seek, you would go with your figures and you would seek funding from a venture capital, they would probably discount your, you know, your valuation by somewhere 40 to 50, if not more %. As simple as that, you know. So I'm not saying that you should lower, you know, how you value your company or what the kind of money you're asking or anything like that. I think that you just have to be slightly reasonable with the figures.
Yeah, I mean, I found a couple of resources this morning online, which I can maybe send you, Bella, afterwards. I think if Bridget has your email, I could send you some resources about calculating ROI for R&D and innovative companies, which might be useful. And maybe also, if you do know any investors, it would actually be good to run just that part of the application by them, just for informal advice, because to be honest, the way investors look at things is probably going to be relatively similar to the way people that assess these grant applications, and they probably have some investors in their panel of judges. So I think that might give you some more realistic idea. But yeah, it's sort of gauging it so that you don't have a crazy figure, because as you say, you know, if I don't know, you know, an existing, let's say, you know, what's the famous Wonder Bra or whatever, you know, has this many sales and this much growth, how's it going to be for a startup where it's, you know, very new and innovative? And by the way, I love the idea of your company, of the well-fitting bras. It's fantastic, and I would definitely use it. But it just needs to be, yeah, within a realistic framework, I think, to make sure that you don't just get cast out because someone says, well, this person has a sort of fantastical view of the likelihood of success of their company.
Thank you.
Lovely. Jean-Marc has a question for you. So Jean-Marc, if you haven't already, if you'd like to unmute and then put your question to Helen.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Yes. First, thank you for hosting this. A friend sent me the link, so I was not too sure if I should have joined, but thank you anyway.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you. Yes, my question is that I had a project on COVID-19, so I'm a data scientist, and I had a project I thought could save a lot of lives, and particularly for the staff, NHS staff. But I didn't know where to find the grant, and I don't have a company. I am just a data scientist. So I ended up not doing anything because it has to be a company. So I sent an email to Innovate UK, but I don't know, they reply, I need to find a company, something like that. So I don't know really what I should have done.
Okay. I mean, I guess in that circumstance, I would say either just register a company really quick. It doesn't take very long. You can do it in a day. Or partner up, see if you can find a partner which has an existing business that you could partner with. If you have a solution that's attractive, a lot of companies are trying to pivot at the moment and go into these kind of solutions because their existing businesses are not able to operate in the usual way. So I'm not sure exactly what kind of solution you had, whether it was sort of health data related or some other solution, but there's a lot of startups out there. So maybe it's not too late. Maybe you can find some startup communities to become part of and start to network with some people online who might be interested. I do know a lot of health startups. So if you want to contact me afterwards and explain just like a short summary of your idea, we could see if we can try and connect you with some relevant people. And then you can apply, obviously, alongside them as a partnership. I know one group that's applying to the Innovate UK today that is about 3 different companies that are all coming together. One's supply chain, one's IoT, and one's actually sort of factory production, and they're all coming together to do a joint application. So it doesn't have to be your company necessarily. You could join forces with another group.
Yes, thank you for that. This is what I tried to do. I contacted a consulting firm I knew on health, and maybe we will do something, but for today it was too late. And I asked you, Innovate UK, if they have a list of company I could try to work with, but they didn't have. So I would be really happy if you could send me a list. So maybe if not for this time, for next time, but maybe it's still possible.
There are also some accelerators that actually help you find a co-founder. So I always thought this was a strange idea because I assume, well, you would have somebody that you work with and you would become co-founders and, that would sort of happen naturally. But there are some circumstances where the accelerators will even have a good idea, but they don't have anyone to run it. So they want to find entrepreneurial people to actually become co-founders and deliver an idea, or the entrepreneur themselves has an idea, but they know they can't do it on their own. So they look to partner them with another co-founder. So that could also be another route to looking into doing something like that.
There's also a Corona Tech handbook, which has been compiled by Edward and his team, and I believe that he's part of the Wikipedia team as well. So he's able to take large amounts of information and make it very searchable. So the other thing that we'll do after this is we're recording it. We'll share again, put some resources on that link as well. So we'll email it out to you so that everyone who's on the call or listening back can have access to that. And so there's funding options in there. There's if you're offering funding, if you're looking for funding, and what projects are happening. So you can see in there who to potentially reach out for, just another source.
Yeah, I think also, just to add to that, this is not the sort of only window in the sense that the EU EIC accelerator has kind of regular deadlines throughout the year. There's a timetable on the European Commission website, I think, where you can see the timetable, and they're kind of including COVID-19 related things into all of their sort of innovation grant applications now, because obviously it's the top political priority. But also people should be thinking further ahead than just, I'm going to do something right now for this. Obviously this is very important, but time is really short to get things off the ground, and people are just scrabbling around to cope. But, there are likely going to be future health crises, not just this one. And, there may be other coronaviruses, sad to say, that may come up in the future. So, also thinking about, what is the solution? It's not just for the current crisis, but for example, if it's supply chain, it could be used right now for COVID-19 related equipment, but maybe in the future it could also be useful for other types of supply chain. So then it becomes a longer term business model that's more attractive for both grant funding applications, but also for investors.
Wonderful. Alicia, do you, I hope I pronounced your name right there. You had a question for Helen. Did you want to unmute and ask that?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm late.
Hi, Alicia.
I wanted to know how important it was in terms of a smart grant application to have a commercial or a route to market partner. in your application?
So I think that might be a question for Bella, because Bella's done the Smart Grant application before.
Oh, sorry. Yes, so I think from my understanding, just talking to people in Innovate UK itself, it's very important. It's important to make sure that it's a customer pull demand. I think they really look for that. So if you have any sort of evidence to say that, you know, we have talked with XYZ, you know, companies or whoever your clients are, and they have validated your concept and would like to trial your solution, I think that's very much appreciated. At the same time, if you at an early stage, my impression of it is they are quite understanding that you might not have like a side contract or a side letter of intent, but it's important for you to state that you have approached XYZ to have these conversations, and you know for sure that there's a demand in the market for your solution. And also be very, this is something that I've learned from the feedback, is be very specific about how you are going to grow after you launch the initial product. So it's not just, so in our first application, we said things like, by year one, we going to get this many clients, this much revenue. Year two, we grow by this much, achieving this much revenue. But apparently that's not really the preferred way. The preferred way is more of, in year one, you approach these clients via, let's say, a trade show to convert 50% of them or something. And then in year two, you expand internationally by working with XYZ partners who can advise you on XYZ. So I hope I'm making sense.
Yes, you're making sense. That's really great.
I think also, going back to your previous question, Bella, that I didn't mention this earlier, but if you're able to find startups that have successfully won those grants before and speak to them about how they did their budgeting and their ROI calculation, they might be willing to give you some advice, rather, because obviously going through the central point, they want to make it a fair competition, so they don't want to necessarily tell you exactly how to do it. But if you can speak to others who've already received funding and say, you know, could I just have half an hour with you to find out how you approach this, I think that could be helpful as well.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah, if you know anyone who have grown the Smart Grant specifically, that will be helpful. But yeah, I will look for that as well.
I don't know if they publish the sort of successful recipients of past grants. I'm not too familiar with that particular application, but maybe there's a way to find out and then contact the people directly.
They have a database of all the grant rewards going back till about 2010, 2012. So
yeah, so I think you could maybe find some people that are in a similar marketplace in apparel, and see if you can approach them and find out some advice from them directly from the startups.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. We had scheduled half an hour for this, so we're coming up with 28 minutes. Does anyone have any other questions for Helen? Okay, that was nice and easy. Helen, do you want to let people know how they can get hold of you? I will, as I say, everyone who's registered for this will email out the recording. I'll get Helen to put in whatever resources and contact details she wants, but also anyone just watching back, Helen, if you'd like them to know how to get hold of you.
Yeah, sure. So my email is helen@unblockedevents.com. You can always email me there. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm @HDisney or @unblockedevents. And yeah, I'll try and share some of the resources I mentioned with Bridget so that she can circulate them to the group.
And if you just mention the bigger pie, so Helen knows where the contact came through, that would be great.
I just had one very quick question. I apologise, I was late. With the UK one, I know the deadline was today. Do they have a later schedule as well for grants, or is it just finishing today in this month?
Not as far as I know, not for that one. I think that particular one is finishing today. If they're completely inundated, which I'm sure they are, they may potentially open up an additional wave, but I think that's it as far as I know.
Okay, thanks. And
do you have any idea how often, I mean, I know COVID-19 is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, but certainly the first time in our lifetime scenario, do you have any ideas or feelings about what future grants might be available? Is that
I mean, there are certain groups that always have kind of funding applications open for innovation. I mean, I mentioned already the EIC, European Commission. There are obviously other kind of grant making bodies, both on the government side and foundation side. So again, maybe we could collate a kind of document with resources about which groups have got, I think you've already started something like that, but we've got things that we see where we can potentially put that all in one place for people to check so that they can just find everything in one place. I think that would be a great thing to do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Helen, for your time, and everyone for joining us. And we'll reach out to you again. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.